Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about how to audit software vendors. And of course, I'm having a little technical difficulty here. 1 second. Okay. So when you're auditing suppliers, presumably those suppliers are higher risk. Otherwise, you wouldn't even waste your time auditing. For example, if you're ordering a metal screw from Grainger, you're not going to probably do an audit of Grainger, because they're a distributor of other parts. And it's an off-the-shelf part. It's not a custom part. And it's a metal screw. But if you're buying more important, especially custom-made things, you might audit that vendor, especially if they make mistakes. In the case of contract manufacturers and contract packagers and contract sterilizers, those three, packagers, sterilizers, and the contract manufacturers. Those are the three vendors that we put in the highest risk category usually for whether we're going to audit companies or not. Those are the three we definitely want to consider auditing. But if your company is a software as a medical device company, who do you have to audit? Well, some companies outsource parts or all of their software development. So in those cases, you might want to audit those companies. But unfortunately, most of the training that we get is geared towards physical manufacturing and not geared towards how to audit software vendors. So that's why we're going to have this presentation. Now, number one, which vendors do you need to audit in the software spectrum? Now, you could look at this, well, I'm not going to audit Microsoft. They're an operating system. They're not going to do anything differently because I audited them, even if they were going to allow me to audit them. So that's an off-the-shelf vendor. They're going to make things to their specification, not to yours. You can buy it or not buy it. So off-the-shelf vendors, you're probably not going to audit. Number two, if it's a software provider that's providing software that you can 100% verify, that's just like if you were buying a low-risk component that you could 100% inspect. So if somebody's developing firmware for you and you can adequately test that firmware, then you probably don't need to worry too much about it. Because it's very simple software. It performs a very specific function and you can probably debug it very quickly. It's probably also a consideration, is this component of software susceptible to any vulnerabilities, such as somebody hacking your software? If you have any software cybersecurity vulnerabilities of your software or firmware, that might put it in a higher risk category. But if it's something that's custom software that is performing an important function of your medical device, somebody's developing an algorithm, somebody's converting your algorithm into a program, somebody's building a mobile app that will spit out a report to a physician, those are going to be much higher risk software. They're actually doing design and development of software. So those are the most important vendors for you to audit. Those operating systems that aren't going to change anything they do, the firmware that's very easy to verify, lower risk. Higher risk items are going to be the things that are custom to your specifications. You've written the SRS, you've written the device description, and they've done the development work for you. So the next question is, how do you conduct an audit of these vendors? A lot of times, especially prior to COVID, people would do audits on site. But software companies, most of the people don't work in an office all the time. They work from home a lot, and everything's on a computer. So there's absolutely no reason why you need to go on site for these vendors. It might be helpful. You might want to do it for other reasons, but these vendors could easily be audited remotely. And since COVID, people have been much more comfortable with the concept of remote auditing. And it is covered in the ISO 19011 standard on how to conduct auditing. So you can do remote audits of these software providers. The next question you can ask yourself is, how frequently do I need to audit these vendors? Once again, it's a risk-based approach. If it's an extremely important vendor for contract manufacturing or contract sterilization, Some companies will choose to audit those vendors every year. Some will do it every other year. Some will do it once every 3 years. But typically, if it's an important vendor that you need to audit, they'll try to make sure that they cover all those vendors in that highest risk category at least once during their certification cycle. Certification cycles are typically 3 years, so once every 3 years or less. So, and when I say less, I mean 2 years or 1 year. So if you have a software vendor that's in the higher risk categories, you might want to audit them more frequently than the lower risk vendors. In the very lowest risk, you may not audit them at all. You might rely on verification. You might do other things. So there might be other things you can do rather than just auditing these vendors. Sometimes we do supplier questionnaires, self-surveys. Sometimes we will ask the vendors to provide certificates and provide updates whenever they update their certificates. So if they're ISO 13485 certified suppliers, you might put them in a little bit lower risk category. We don't need to audit them. They've already been audited by their certification body. So we're just going to rely on reviewing these surveys and keeping their certificate up to date and watch their performance. If we have problems with performance, then maybe we'll do an audit. So that's the same way you would handle some of these other vendors that are in a moderate risk category. Another thing that you want to look at is what kind of certifications do these vendors have? So just like a vendor that is going to be a contract manufacturer, contract packager, some of them will have ISO 9001, some will have ISO 1345. 1345 is specific to the medical device industry, so we generally rate that a little bit higher importance than a 9001 certificate. So we put them in a lower risk category if they have the 1345 and a higher risk category if they have 9001 certification only. But there are other standards that we should be looking at too that are much more pertinent to cybersecurity and for software development. So one of those would be the IEC 62304. That would be for software, the software lifecycle. Another standard, and I'm actually going to share my screen in order to do this. There we go. I should have set this up ahead of time. Sorry about that. So this is the standard for IEC. It's ISO and IEC developed this standard. It's 27001. It's a 2023 standard, and so it's very new, but it's specifically for information security, cybersecurity, and privacy protection. So patient-protected health information. It's not recognized by the FDA, but it is a European normative standard, so that's why it has the EVS.EE in the front. The EVS tells you where I bought it from. That's the Estonian Standards Organization, but the EN tells you it's a European norm. ISO tells you ISO developed the standard. IEC says IEC developed the standard. The / tells you they worked on it together. So this standard has a lot of the same structure that you would expect to see for ISO 1345. And I'm going to scroll down, and hopefully I'll be able to show you this pretty quickly. So here's the organization of the standard. If you look at this organization is very similar to 9001 and 1345 in terms of the sections that are included and what's in those sections. So they've tried to model the standard after those general quality system management standard and also ISO 1345, but they've made some minor changes to it to reflect that it's software instead of a physical product, and it's not a sterile product, of course. So that's one of the important standards, and it's specific to security. And then you have the IEC 62304 for software development. There are other standards. There's risk management standards that are important. There's TIR 57, which is a guidance document related to cybersecurity. So lots of standards out there, but this is a relatively new one. It's a 2023 standard, and it aligns with 1345 and 9001. So if you were a software vendor, this might be something you would consider getting certification to. But even if you didn't get certification, at least you might be compliant with this standard. And you might consider as an auditor, maybe this is something that you should get qualification and training on. And it could be self-training, so you read the standard and learn how it aligns with the other standards like 1345 and come up with an audit plan and an audit agenda, maybe practice auditing on this, maybe read other materials on related standards to this. Maybe some of the books, things are in the bibliography. If you scroll down the bottom, they always have a bibliography in the bottom of these. So page 19 of the standard would have that information. So that's how you can train on these standards, plus maybe some of your experience. Maybe you were a software developer before you became an auditor. Maybe you've worked on cybersecurity testing, pen testing, vulnerability testing, red team, blue team stuff. So that's something you might want to consider for your training and certification as an auditor, in addition to just being a general lead auditor qualified to ISO 19011 or 19011. So I'm going to stop sharing that for a moment, and we'll go back to just me. So the next thing we look at is, does your vendor compliance questionnaire need to be changed at all? One of my pet peeves, partly it's a really busy guy, and somebody sends me a supplier questionnaire, and it's got 5 billion questions that are not applicable to me. Why do I have to answer these? Please design your supplier questionnaires so sections are only applicable if you fall into that category. So if you're a software, put something at the beginning and says, fill out these sections if you're this type of vendor. Fill out these sections if you're this type of vendor. Or even better yet, don't even send me those sections. Just send me the sections that are applicable to me. But people that design their forms so we have to actually type in NA, I mean, yes, in principle, it shows that I really want your business, but it's wasting time. It's not adding value for me. It's not adding value for you. All it's doing is asking me to fill out paperwork and write NA in a whole bunch of places. So only have the vendor fill out the sections that are applicable, and have sections that are specific to software, have sections that are specific to firmware, have sections that are specific to operating systems. Anybody that's working on open source software, make sure they're using the most current versions of open source software. Make sure they have these certifications in training to IEC 62304 or this ISO IEC 27001 or training into TIR 57. Make sure they have that. So that should be part of your supplier questionnaire. You might want to ask for what kind of training they've gone through. Maybe you'll learn from them in the process. But adapt your supplier questionnaires so the sections are appropriate for the vendor. If you had a sterilization vendor, you're going to ask questions about sterilization. You might ask about microbiology. You might ask about the biological indicators. You might ask what kind of timeline they have between the time that they start incubating the biological indicators to the time they can release the lot, or what kind of dosimeters they use. A little while back, we had a problem with dosimeters, and a whole bunch of product had to be recalled because the dosimeters that they used weren't calibrated properly. So if you know that information in your supplier questionnaire, you know if that risk is applicable to that vendor. That's the purpose of the questionnaires. And you may fill that out for all vendors, but you might only fill it out for the higher risk vendors. Or if you're going to do an audit, say we'll do the questionnaires only for the lower risk. We'll do it for initial qualification and only for the lower risk vendors on an ongoing basis. So you figure out what are the appropriate controls for your suppliers. But to summarize this, number one, with all vendors, always use a risk-based approach. That's number one. Number two, make sure that you pick the frequency that's risk-based as well. Make sure your auditors are qualified and trained to those standards. Make sure you ask questions in your compliance questionnaire about those vendors to make sure that they're compliant, and make sure that the quality system and your expectations are aligned both with software requirements and the cybersecurity or information security requirements. But there's one last thing that I see a lot of people missing, and that's the patient-protected health information. When we look at these software databases and you have vendors that might be hosting your software, you might have patient-protected health information that's in there, and you want to make sure that your vendors aren't able to access that patient-protected health information, that it's secure, it's encrypted. Those are things you want to be looking at. So make sure you also include like HIPAA compliance and GSPR requirements. Include that in the design requirements. Design it so the software is anonymized or the data is anonymized, so you have a patient number instead of a name and a birth date and things like that. And so that should be part of your policy on patient-protected health information, as well as something your auditors look for when you audit those vendors, that they're considering that as well. Okay, so that's our summary of how we attack the software vendors and how we are going to audit them, qualify them, make sure that they're doing a good job for us from a quality system standards perspective. And you don't just say, oh, they're low risk, they can't physically hurt somebody. They can still create hazardous situations. They're still a critical part of your product, and you should be applying supplier controls to them. So that's the end of this week's webinar. If you know of anybody else that needs help with supplier auditing, especially software, share this video with them, share the link to it. It'll help them. And if you have any follow-on questions that I didn't address, please put them in the comments below for this video, and I'll go ahead and answer them on our YouTube channel and other channels like LinkedIn and Facebook. Stay tuned. We're also going to have some guest webinars in the near future. December 13th in particular, we're expecting to have a guest that's going to be talking on grant applications. So anybody out there that's interested in non-dilutive funding for their medical device startup, stay tuned December 13th, and we'll announce that shortly. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.